Now, something somewhat similar is happening with a very salient issue today, and that's the Iranian nuclear question. Now, there is no doubt that there is a lot of genuine concern in Israel, and I'm talking about the population, not just about the government, about the specter of an Iranian nuclear weapon. But if that were the only motivation here, then the government of Israel would be supporting the current negotiating effort, which is clearly the best chance that the world has had in the last 30 years to cap and control the Iranian nuclear program in a way that would give us the assurance that it's going to stay peaceful. Just look at what was achieved with the preliminary agreement, the so-called Joint Plan of Action that was negotiated with the Iranians and completed last November. That alone, even if it were just extended indefinitely, got most of what we need to get in terms of enhanced inspections, in terms of putting a cap on the low-enriched uranium, in terms of doing away with the medium-enriched uranium, having restrictions on any further advances that mean anything at their nuclear reactor, and so on and so forth. And yet, the government of Israel, far from supporting these negotiations, has been doing everything it can to sabotage and undermine them, including promoting legislation in this country that would have that effect. And so one has to conclude that the Israeli policy here is not driven just by a concern about an Iranian nuke. It's driven by other objectives. The main objective, as I would describe it, is to keep in play the issue of a possible Iranian nuclear weapon, because that immediately can be translated into Israeli security. Now, never mind that, if, contrary to the current policy, Iran ever were to build a nuke, this would be one nuke against the 200 or however it is that Israel has. We still are within reach very much of that objective of securing an agreement that gives us confidence that there never will be an Iranian nuke. And yet, the major theme, probably the single overriding theme in national and foreign and security policy that the current Israeli government has propounded is the anti-Iranian theme. And if you listen to the Israeli Prime Minister's speech that he gave a few blocks away at the Convention Center earlier this week, the first half of the speech was all about how awful Iran is. Now, a lot of what he said, even if you believed it, still does not lead to the conclusion that we ought to undermine the negotiations aimed at making sure we don't have an Iranian nuke. If anything, if you believed it, that's all the more reason to hope that the negotiations succeed rather than to sabotage them. But let me just mention a couple of things that the Prime Minister said, because he really has been straining to make the case. I mean, he refers to the Iranian nuclear weapons program. Well, according to the U.S. intelligence community, Iran has not decided to build a nuclear weapon, and any of their weapons design work was ended over a decade ago. He also said, I'm trying to get almost his exact words here, that Iran publicly calls for the destruction of Israel. I'm pretty familiar with Iranian public government statements, and I have a hard time finding anything. There was one thing that the former president, Ahmadinejad, said a few years ago that got mistranslated into you're wiping Israel off the map or something like that. If you ask the current Iranian government what their perspective on this is, well, the Iranian foreign minister, Mr. Zarif, said if the Palestinian issue can be resolved, he foresees actually having full diplomatic relations between the Iranians and the Israelis. I'm not predicting that's going to happen anytime soon, but it certainly shows you how far from the truth is any statement that Iran publicly calls for Israel's destruction. And then the Prime Minister said, as another example, Iran continues to build ICBMs. I don't know how to put this, but the most charitable way is that's flat-rate false. Insofar as anything we know, there's no indication they're doing anything with ICBMs or even IRBMs, the next lower range. They do have medium-range ballistic missiles, but even on those, they haven't been doing much in the way of testing or development so far. So what does this, all of this constant drumbeat of this Iranian specter do for Mr. Netanyahu's government? Well, it serves as the best kind of distraction you possibly could have from things that the Prime Minister perhaps would rather not talk about, some of which have been the subject of earlier presentations here today, such as the occupation. It keeps Iran ostracized. It keeps it as an international pariah and therefore is not going to be a competitor for influence with Israel in the Middle East. And in particular, it precludes any competition for U.S. attention as a partner in things where we might want to work with other governments, and not just with the Israelis in this region, to advance our interests. And however much Iran may still be an adversary in other respects, the fact is we actually have some parallel interests with them with regard to things like stability in Afghanistan, where some of you may recall there was a brief window back in 2000 and 2001 in which we were actually working closely, our diplomats and Iranian diplomats, to bring about political change and transition and the installation of the Karzai government in Afghanistan. That lasted for just a few months before our president declared the axis of evil. And members of the neocon persuasion told Iran, take a number. We're getting Iraq first, we'll get you next. All of this runs very much counter to the U.S. interests, both with regard to complicating the effort to get that agreement to make sure that the Iranian nuclear program stays peaceful, and also by constraining U.S. diplomacy throughout the region and preventing us from doing things like talking to the Iranians about how to keep Afghanistan stable. My concluding thought about all this is that not just with regard to the U.S.-Israeli relationship, but indeed our relationship with any other countries, ones that we might call allies or ones that we might call adversaries, that it would be better just to forget about those labels and look at specific interests and where a particular country can help us and where it doesn't help us with regard to things that are important to us. And U.S. foreign policy and national security would be much better served if we did that. Thank you very much.